Greg's actually a native of Minnesota, so we were pretty lucky to swipe him, get him into North Dakota. He stayed, which is the best part. Sometimes they don't always stay, but Greg did stay. Greg's got his educational background, his Bachelor of Science and Master of Science from North Dakota State University. He's been at the Research Center here since 1990. He's an area research specialist concentrating in cropping systems.
What I plan to do is talk on a couple establishment factors in corn, and then I'll move to soybean. And I'll be showing you a compilation of data on quite a number of soybean establishment factors. And then I'm going to go into some details on one. And then I'm going to end with a fairly short but I think important message relating to soybean, corn, and as well as some other crops. So that's my plan. We had a nice turnout for our row crop tour last September, and this is one of the stops. So for those of you that are on the tour, you maybe remember this. This study we started quite a few years ago, actually in, I believe it was in 2008. We started with a simple tillage comparison, and then we've added some things and dropped some things out when we've generated enough data. So this past season, our main focus was two things: a continuation of the look of starter fertilizer impact on corn, and then the second was row spacing. So I'm going to show you some data regarding those two factors. Before I get into the starter fertilizer, just a quick reminder about our NDSU's general recommendations. And one is that we'd like to encourage you to build up your soils for P and K. K typically isn't a problem for you. You normally have K, but watch your soil tests as you continue a corn and soybean rotation, because that will drive down the K. But more importantly is phosphorus. And these are the general levels we think are critical levels to raise that yield ceiling. And then regarding specifically starter, we recommend starter, phosphorus in particular, no matter what your soil test levels are. And we define a starter as something placed in a band within 2 inches of the seed. And then, of course, corn responds to zinc, in particular if your soil test indicates less than a part per million. All right, well, here's some data. This is from our past season, and these are our starter fertilizer treatments. This is important to note that we had a very low testing soil, or low, 5 parts per million. And then I'll define the treatments a little bit, and then after this, then I'll show you larger databases on some side-by-side comparisons. So notice this is strip till corn. We've been using the strip till and doing the fertilizer comparisons because with the strip till we can have a deep banded treatment. And so we typically have done that in the fall, but this year we did it in the spring just because the previous fall was a tough one to get our work done. So this is spring pre-plant deep band, and the deep band was where the fertilizer, or the tillage and the fertilizer was placed 5 to 6 inches. And the fertilizer we're using was, of course, 1034-0. Another treatment that we've included for several years is doing the deep band as well as in furrow. Because our phosphorus level was so low, we used a fairly high rate of 1034-0. We used 12 gallons. And this is based on our recommendation tables that's in our fertilizer guide. So with this treatment, we split the 12 gallons, half or 6 when we deep banded, and then the other half, the 6 gallons, was in furrow. And then our standard is the 2x0 band, meaning that the fertilizer is placed 2 inches horizontally from the seed placement. And that differs from what we call a 2x2 band. A 2x2 would be 2 inches over from the seed, but also 2 inches down. And then this year we added a broadcast application just to have that comparison. And with the bandage, we cut the rate by 1/3. With the bandage, we use a full rate. And so we use 18 gallons of 1034-0 surface applied after planting, but on the same day. And then, of course, untreated check. So that's what our data looks like just from last year's trial, but we don't want to go too far with just 1 year's worth of data. So here's some side-by-side comparisons now where we have larger databases. Also note the phosphorus levels. The first year of the work, we were in great shape, 20 parts per million. But since that time, we had more of a typical phosphorus level, and we would expect more response. So in furrow versus the band, yeah, we saw across these 4 site years an increase in yield with the band. But keep in mind that we did see some stand losses with the in-furrow because of the rates we're using. In general, we recommend 3 gallons of 1034-0 as the in-furrow treatment for corn. And in our prior work, as well as the work I'm showing you, in most cases, we were fine on stand and yield if we were under 6 gallons per acre. But in 2012, for example, our soil test was low, only 6 parts per million, so we put on 12 gallons of 1034-0 in furrow. So that's part of the reason we see a drop in the average yield over these 4 site years compared to the 2x0 band. The main thing I want to emphasize is a banded application is what we recommend, and we do see responses. Well, how about the deep band side-by-side comparison with the 2x0 band? Well, this is 5 site years of data, and a very slight advantage if we look at the averages. Statistically, no difference each year. In fact, we've had a really difficult time seeing true yield responses with the various treatments that we've used. I'm not sure what to do different, but that's what was happening. And then the treatment that's in particular I was interested in is the one that came from some work in Minnesota and Illinois, where they're splitting the treatments. They're doing part deep banded, and then at planting time in-furrow treatment. So a couple pictures. This was in 2012. This is about 2 months after the corn was planted, a little less than that. Here's the deep band in-furrow compared to the untreated check. Quite a difference. Mike had mentioned the differences they saw in the intensive management trial early in the season. I mean, this is getting well along. We still, at least in some comparisons, saw some nice visual differences. And here's a look at last year. This is a little after a month after planting. And this is the 2x0, or the 2-inch band, compared to the deep band and the in-furrow. Equivalent rates, just placed differently. It was kind of exciting to see that. But not every, when I walked down all 4 reps, we didn't always see this visual difference. But then what are the results? Well, here they are. This is a look at all 3 years that we had that comparison, the deep band in-furrow with the 2-inch band. I also included the deep band. So in 2010, the first year, it was pretty exciting. That particular treatment saw a nice, at least numeric jump compared to the 2-inch band. But in 2012 and 13, it hung in there with the 2-inch, but at least in 2012 it did. Last year, the 2-inch band did look good, or looked the best numerically. And just for ease, this is the average over those 3 years, and our conclusions would be that this treatment looks good, but it's not performing any better in our data compared to the 2-inch band. Okay, the other factor, corn row spacing, Blaine alluded to it earlier. And so I'm going to show you some data that we've generated either at Oaks or here. This is a comparison of 15 versus 30-inch rows, 8 site years of data, very high yield environments. Of course, at Oaks it was irrigated. At Carrington, some was irrigated, some was dry land. But there was a slight increase in yield. Average over the 8 site years was 1.5 percentage point. On the presentation that the agents gave, if you remember, Joel showed a slide on the different factors on improving yield. He showed on row spacing for corn, it was anywhere from 0 to 4. And so this would certainly fall into that range at 1.5% increase with the narrow rows versus the 30-inch. Recently, we're comparing 22 to 30-inch rows, and this is a picture taken from the trial last year. And here's the data. Keep in mind, it's only 2 years. I show each year and then the average. The average is in the yellow bars. And so each year, there was either a numeric or a statistical increase in the yield with the 22-inch versus the 30. And looking at the 2-year average, the difference here was about 5.5%, or bushel-wise, it was about a 10-bushel advantage. So 5.5, a little bit above that range on that slide that Joel showed you, but still significant. Will that always hold true, or we're going to continue making this comparison? You might wonder about the plant population. In both years, our plant population was 30K, plus or minus 1 to 2 thousand. So that's kind of an answer to the question to Blaine about the row spacing that he had. Yeah, it'd be nice to look at the narrow rows And we have some of that data where maybe higher plant populations would enhance the narrow rows. So a summary of what I've talked about so far and the 2 factors in corn. Here's the starter fertilizer. It's either 3 or 5 years depending on the factor, but the 2-inch band we found to be similar to the combination deep band and furrow, a little bit greater than deep band, and any of these treatments greater than the untreated check. And then here's the numbers on the row spacing. But again, it's limited data. On soybean, we've been doing a fair amount of work through the years, building an establishment database, and including this last year's trial. This is stopped during the row crop 2 or less September as well. And in the current year's work, we were looking at the factors that are listed on the sign. I'm not going to go through all those. There'll be other times for that. A lot of you have seen this table, and but we'll talk a little bit about it. We continue to update it based on our research. And I guess something that's significant is there's a lot of resources and work that went behind these numbers. It looks simple, but a lot of years and a lot of effort into it. So here's 9 factors, and for those of you that haven't seen this, we got the 9 factors listed. We'd like you to be in the A column versus the B because of the yield advantage with the A column. And then we have the number of site years listed to back up those numbers. So we're doing quite well in quite a number of these factors, such as the tillage, seed fungicide, planting rate, row spacing. So we feel pretty confident of them, but people still ask. And so we have some ammunition, if you will, for continue to work, maybe fine-tuning things such as maybe the interaction of row spacing and plant population, or planting date and row spacing, or other combinations. Some other factors, you notice that we don't have a lot of site years. Although I'm pretty confident in our previous crop work where we don't have to continue that work, but maybe there'll be others that will be interested in that. Seed inoculation with soybean history, you see, unfortunately we're not showing much, but we're recommending. We think it's just a really good idea to, regardless of your prior soybean history, to inoculate the seed. But we got to find more data to support that. So far we're not doing so well. What else? I'm going to say this to end. Phosphorus at planting time. We continue to do that work. We recommend broadcast versus banded, but so far, with limited work, we don't have the data to confirm that. But we're still recommending the broadcast P if we have that choice. And then timing of weed removal. A few years ago, a lot of people were relying only on post-emergence weed control in soybean, and that was fine. We encouraged them to make the application when the weeds were 2 to 4 inches, but some people have difficulty with that measurement, and they think that 2 to 4 is something like that. But now, we have a new issue, of course, and that's weed resistance, and so we're strongly encouraging people to begin their timing of weed removal right at planting time. But the one fact I do want to show a little bit of detail on is the planting date. We're really excited about the early numbers we have on planting soybeans earlier than normal. Planting that first week in May or earlier, like the last week in April, because of limited data, but look at the yield advantage. And here's a graphic of what we found in our preliminary data. Here's the planting dates. Please note those. 3 out of 4 of the site years we statistically saw yield increase. And across the board, averages 13% yield increase by that early planting. And realize there's risk here, there's crop insurance, a lot of things to think about. But when we planted, we did plant when the soil conditions were at least near fit. We weren't muddying it in, just trying to get it in early. We tried to be careful about that. Okay, so we wanted to continue that in 2013, and you guys know that story. It didn't happen. So we went to plan B, and that was, well, we're still going to do the planting date, but we'll go on the other end. Maybe it'll be another 10 years before you guys are planting your soybeans in June. I hope that's the case. But if not, we thought it's important, well, let's add some more data. We had some older data. This was generated about a decade ago by Bob Henson and company. And in this comparison here at Carrington, 3 site years, we saw a 6% yield advantage. So here's what we did this year. 3 sites and the planting dates. Notice the earliest was May 13th at Prosper, and then we went into June. And then down below is actual data, maybe a little bit hard to read, but even at Wishick, where we had single-digit yields, when we planted earlier, we statistically saw a yield increase, although not much there. But the bottom line is that, yeah, we even with the later planting dates, get it in when possible, provided advantages versus later. And then also NDSU researcher Burton Johnson, he had a trial here at Prosper, and the planting dates are listed below. He had 2 different cultivars, and so you see the Carrington data is here, Prosper is the red line, and then the 2-site average. It's interesting at Carrington that his data is showing very stable yields until he got to the very latest planting date, which was on June 21st. But certainly the trend for the 2-site average was, yeah, a decline with time. So what I did is I put the data together from 4 of the trials that matched up, where the planting was the last week in May versus the second week in June. And here's what we found. It was timely, of course, to get the crop in the first part of May. So what can we pull from this? Well, with actually 3 studies that were conducted, by planting in mid-May, or at least the last half of May, versus in June, when you get into June, we saw a decline of 6 to 10%. Because this data here is actually a 10% drop. So I guess that would be the story we could tell you from our data. If we have another year like this past one where you're forced, or for whatever reason you're planting in June, what are the consequences on yield? Last week at the Wells County Winter Show, they were celebrating their 75th anniversary. Lindsay had a nice display. I took some time and looked at it, and I captured this little flyer from the 1964 Wells County Winter Show. And lo and behold, look at one of the subjects, management of alkali gumbo soils. Now, if Dave Franson, I don't think he's here yet, but Dave Franson hates this word. And so don't say that this afternoon, or you may become an enemy of his. But look at 60 years and we're still battling salt-affected soils. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that and have a simple message for you, and also just let you know that Ezra and company are doing work to identify a larger crop group to help tolerate our soils. You know, last year we had so many soybeans in the state and all over the state, from here to Beach and Williston, and a lot of those fields are located on very questionable soils, just soils that didn't hold crop yield, in particular because of our dry July and August. But there were other reasons too. Was it just poor soil, or was it headlands, maybe some compaction early, or maybe was it salinity? So this was seen commonly this year. So was this. This actually is a dry bean field, but for purposes of the discussion, it works well. You know, we had lots of prevent and plant. Most people would be happy just to have this small area of a quarter, or whatever the field size was, that they couldn't plant. But the problem is, nothing was growing there. It was tilled, just a prime environment for bringing up salts. And it's hard to see, I know, but there was appearance of some white stuff showing up here. So the simple story is, number one is, let's soil test those areas, find out what the EC is. And if you want to take it further, it'd probably be a good idea, soil test the transition areas from where the poor areas are, whether it's crop or lower producing crop or no crop, and then those areas transitioning to the crop is good. And this is an example of a soil test, actually egg lice test. John, see you in the back. And so if your sample, you request the salt information. What if your salts come in at 3.9? We'd sure like them to see lower. Just the graphic here shows that the salt level is high. So what do we do? Well, number one, we said get your number. It means soil sample. Number two is select your plan based on that number. And so hopefully you don't have to deal with this. If your EC is under 2, you're in good shape, but just be careful about excessive tillage, Ideally, it'd be nice to keep something growing there all year long, with the whole idea of keeping the water table down, and if water comes up, we like to have it go through plant roots instead of just coming up to the surface, evaporating, and leaving, guess what, behind? The salts. But the problem is, we have a lot of those areas, like the picture I showed, that are in this category. And so what we suggest, and it's still relatively easy, is plant crops with some tolerance of salinity. And we have a couple or three listed here. As well as, like I mentioned earlier, keep plant cover as long as possible, reduce tillage. So I know you guys have a lot of challenges, but you have opportunities to at least stabilize the problem or make it better if you act in 2014 or beyond. So how about those areas that are 2 or 5 or 10 acres? Ideally, if you can treat them differently and plant a salt-tolerant crop in those, if you have an EC in this area, in the long run, you'll make those soils more productive. If you don't do that, here's what we're going to end up with. And if we get to this point, I've been talking about salt soils, or will be, for 5 to 7 minutes. You might be hard-pressed to solve this problem in 5 to 7 years if you don't do anything. If you don't do anything with those soils, 2 to 4, especially pushing 4, EC versus, and we get to something like this. It could be 8, 12, or whatever it might be. So we don't want to go here. If we do, please don't talk to me. It's someone else that has more expertise. So I alluded to earlier, we have some folks here that are doing some screening work. We have a nice site by the pasta plant where we're screening a lot of different plants, perennials, as well as cover crops, perennials and annuals, and then as well as cash crops to establish a newer database on tolerance. And I'm just going to tease you with actually one slide. And here's one that I like, that Mike Osley has shown in the past. We're looking at ECs on the bottom, relative plant density is here, 100% is here, and then of course it goes down, and measurements with barley, energy beet, soybean, and spring wheat. So if we look at soybean, here's the soybean line, and here's the 2 EC. Just right at 2, already we lost our plant population. Was cut in half. Look at barley, and you guys know this, but just a reminder, barley is here. It took all the way to 6 EC before the plant population was dropped. And then spring wheat was somewhere in between these. I don't have any yield data to show you, so this graph I think will suffice for today. This is a different database, but just let's take a look at the crops we're talking about today, and then a couple others. For example, here's soybean and here's corn. Look what happens when we get past 4. Dramatic drop in relative yield as compared to when we have good soils out there. And then look at some of these other crops that have tolerance. For example, sunflower. I know sunflowers isn't real popular, but certainly it has tolerance. Sugar beets certainly look good. As the prior slide, I forgot to point out, but that looked very good in our work so far. And then barley is here. Certainly we know that's tolerant, and this graphic shows that as well. The one crop that maybe revision would be needed would be the wheat. Wheat seems to be hanging with this tolerant group, and I'm not so sure I'm quite sure it's not as good. It's maybe somewhere in between. So just a quick look at some of the work we're doing, and again, remind you, soil test. If you're in this EC level, do something about it while you have the chance to still maintain and improve your soils versus getting down here. And then we have a nice circular. It's been around a long time. It was revised in 2012, Managing Saline Soils in North Dakota. You probably have it. If you don't, it's available electronically, or contact one of your extension agents and they'll get it to you. Any questions or comments? The question was, have we experimented with lime to change the pH? Here at the center, our soils, the soil pH varies a lot. I think the lowest I've seen is 5.8 or 5.9, and then we've been up in the 8s somewhere. But those 5s and even low 6s are not real common. So I guess I'm not aware of work we've done with lime. Not that it hasn't been done elsewhere.